Welcome to today's episode of Tea and Talks with myself, Owen Smith. Today we're joined by local actor Reg Wheeler. So thank you for joining us, Reg. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Bearing up under this pestilence.
I know, isn't it? How is your lockdown?
We survive. Yeah, Rita's there with her puzzle books and I have my garden.
Yeah, I can imagine it. And how are the kids doing?
They're doing well. They do my shopping for me. They sort of give me a phone call, ask me what I want and leave it at the front door. And just, it's like knock down ginger without the villainy.
So tell me a bit about Reg. Where did you actually grow up?
I was born in Goodmayes in what is now laughingly called the London Borough of Redbridge. But when I was born there, it was in Essex. But I was born within the stone's throw of Goodmayes Park. I moved from Goodmayes to Coventry Road, Ilford, when I was 11, 1952. And I went to Christchurch School, which it's within the throes of the Kenneth More Theatre. And then I moved with my parents over to Clayhall. So I grew up in the London Borough of Redbridge, all over the place.
But when it was still Essex, as it were?
Yes, when it was still Essex. I passed the 11 plus, and of course all my friends were going to these places called Wanstead County High, Ilford County High, Beale, but they bundled me off to a place called Leighton. Because Leighton I'd never heard of.
I mean, I've always known you through the theatre. Like, I remember growing up, watching you perform, and I remember doing, of course, in 1993, we did Sound of Music together.
Right.
So how did you sort of become involved in the Kenneth More, as it were?
I belonged to a little review group at the time called Stradbroke Entertainments. They gave their name, incidentally, to the Quick Change Room in the Kenneth More Theatre.
I've never known that.
No, but that was it. There was a guy and his wife called Joyce and Derek Hall, who maintained their links to the theatre up until their deaths some years ago. But they joined the theatre in 1974 in May, shortly after it opened, and they did a show called Redbridge Under Review. And that was their first show there. About 4 or 5 years later, Vivian asked me to be in his production of the Scottish play Macbeth in 1978, in which Peter Beadle played Macbeth.
You sort of then stayed around ever since.
Ever since, yeah. I always did like the straight plays. That was my love. But when I got to do what Viv wanted to do, he stretched me to such a degree that I found that I had other abilities. I found that I had a talent for comedy. I could do stand-up comedy. I could sing. And that all these things were a revelation to me. And it's he, who, whatever talent I had, he found it.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which Viv did with so many people.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was always very good at spotting where you needed to go, as it were.
Yeah, terrific.
But where did you perform before the Kenneth More?
We did with Stradbroke. We did these little shows at Park Hill School, which is Barkingside, and before that, I did a few shows with a little group of people called the Happy Wanderers. They were just a little review group. But my first love of theatre came from the school, came from Leighton County High. I'll tell you a little story. In the third form, I don't know what's that, year 9, is it, in New Money?
I'm never sure. I always have to ask someone. There's a way apparently that if I +5 or something onto it, I get it, but I've never understood it.
Well, it was in the third year,
right.
and I was appointed as the form captain, and it was the form captain's job to go to the staff room and find out if any of the teachers had any messages they wanted carried back to the form. And I was summoned one day by the head of English, a guy called Bobby Brown, who also did the school plays. And he asked me to go there, and he said, I want you to take a message back to your form. He said, there's a part going in the Christmas play. So I said, I'll do it. and Rita will tell you that's the way I've lived my life. Speak first, think afterwards. So I went along to the rehearsal that night, and I wrote out my lines on a piece of paper, and I think I'd learned them in 5 minutes. Can't learn lines like that now anymore, I'm afraid. And that's it. I was hooked, and we did half a dozen, 7 or 8 plays while I was there.
Now, I remember you telling me a story years ago. I think it was, we were in a music hall of some form together, that you once played the female lead opposite one of our Knights of the Realm, wasn't you?
Yeah. In 1956, Christmas 1956, I was 15 years old, and we did Hamlet, and I played Queen Gertrude, whom, as you know, is Hamlet's mum. And our Hamlet was, as you say, one of the Knights of the Realm. Our Hamlet was Derek Jacobi. And I mean, he's 2 years older than I am, and I played his mum.
What's he like?
Well, about 6 months after that, we took this production to the Edinburgh Fringe, and we played the festival for 3 weeks.
Really?
At the Edinburgh in 1957, at the Edinburgh Festival. And what's he like? A number of people have asked me, has he changed much? My answer is no, because he was always that good.
Really?
Yeah. I haven't, I mean, I've seen a maturity, I've seen a development, but it's only a development that has occurred because the fundamental talent was there.
Mm.
In fact, so much that I've done, particularly in Shakespeare, I've asked myself how Derek would have said those lines. Yeah. And Viv did a sort of a very strange production of Hamlet. It wasn't the true text. And I mean, Nick Greenshields played one of the Hamlet.
I remember seeing this. It was with 2 Hamlets, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's it. And I passionately wanted to play Claudius, the king.
Mm.
And Viv let me do that. And I'm hearing Derek's lines all the time, the way he's saying them. And that influenced what I did in that play, certainly.
What was the Fringe like back then? Because that's now become almost the cattle mask kit, hasn't it?
Yeah, I certainly don't think it was the, because I think the Edinburgh Festival just started in the 50s. Anyway, I don't know the actual first date, but we played at the Edinburgh Academy, which was a school, a very, very famous school. Sir Walter Scott went there.
Oh.
It's just over the hill in a place called Henderson Row. And it was the auditorium was an oval with wooden paneling all round it. The acoustics were wonderful. I can't remember how many it sat, not very many, about 300 or 400. But we played this for 27 performances in 3 weeks. And it was just absolutely wonderful. But I was 15 years old. I wasn't at that stage into the theatre deeply. It was a great adventure. You know, I just loved being in Edinburgh, loved the city. I had family connections there by a couple of aunts and things like that. But it was just, the whole thing was an adventure. Although we saw other shows, we were able to get tickets to other shows. And we had this Bobby Brown that I speak of, and in fact Derek Jacobi speaks of him in his book. He was a very enterprising guy. He set the whole thing up in the first place. And taking 30 boys in the school holidays up to Edinburgh was quite an adventure, I think.
So your career also then sort of took more of a respectable turn, didn't it?
Well, yeah, I suppose you could say that. Yeah, I don't mind you calling it that. A respectable turn. Yeah, yeah. But at that stage, we had done a couple of Shakespeare's and a couple of serious plays. We did the Miser, Molière, The Last of the Incas. So we did serious plays at school. Then, of course, I joined the Stradbroke, and then we were doing little review pieces and sketches and things like that. And it was almost as if in 1978, Viv came along and said, "Come on, let's do some proper work here," and and steered me in the right direction again.
How was the theatre in its early days? What was it like? Did you ever work at the Little Theatre? Or?
No, I never got to the Little Theatre. I worked at the Cranbrook Theatre for 4 years after we did Park Hill School. Did the Cranbrook, did a few things there.
That was the old church, wasn't it?
That's the old church, yes. Still there as a building, but I mean, it's undergone a number of incarnations since it was a church. But no, I never did actually work at the Little Theatre. But the theatre, the Kenneth More Theatre, was conceived primarily for amateurs, and we only got a foothold in there because of Joyce Hall and doing this review group. But the review group would never ever have totally satisfied me, because all they were doing were sketches and little bits of music and things like that. Nobody was going to. Stradbroke was never going to do a Shakespeare.
What's the first musical you ended up doing for Viv?
For Viv, the first one was The Fantastics.
Oh, really?
It was Steve Fisher, Laura Neyman, Don Fletcher, Martin File, and Lawrence Payne was the musical director, and it was The Fantastics, and I adored it. It was a lovely little show. Beautiful thing. It's one of the longest running shows on off Broadway, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even so, I think they ended up calling the theatre the Jerry Orbach.
Oh, okay.
Because it ran for so long.
Okay. Yeah. And so I did the Fantastics for Viv. Then we did Macbeth, and then and by that time I had fallen in love with a character called Cyrano de Bergerac. And then I heard that in 1979, Viv was going to do Cyrano de Bergerac. And I went along to the audition and eventually got the part that I wanted. And it was like a dream. It's something you want passionately, something you'd almost kill for, and then it drops in your lap.
And what's out of the musicals that you've done, what's been your favourite characters you've played?
I liked Assassins. I liked the Sondheim Assassins, which was much later. Sound of Music was okay, but the one I really enjoyed was The King and I.
Oh, really?
With Eileen Batty, who is now working in the Alan Ayckbourn, isn't she? She does a lot of work, I think, for Alan Ayckbourn, but she had just actually come from a run of, or Yul Brynner's last run of The King at the Palladium.
Right.
And he was doing that with Virginia McKenna, and I think Virginia McKenna had a week's break or something, and Eileen Batty went on to do the understudy, and then she came almost straight away to do Mrs. Anna for us. And she was wonderful. I mean, that whole thing was just absolutely magnificent. Costumes, Margaret Bryce and everything, lovely stuff like that.
Some of the masks are still in the theatre, and they've not aged at all. They're still beautiful. Right. The Uncle Tom masks are absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. Then it has to come up to 1984 or 82 to Amadeus, which was, it's the part of a lifetime. I suppose I could say in almost, I've had several parts of a lifetime. Each one has been special, but then there comes up to a climax, and the real thing was Amadeus, and we did that 4 times.
Really? I remember seeing it twice. I didn't realise it was that many.
Yep.
And I've seen you do your Max Miller many times. One of my favourites as a child.
Really?
Yeah, I used to love it. Absolutely used to love it, because my nan, we used to go and watch the Enster shows, which were always a huge highlight.
Yes.
And I always remember from your Max Miller how did you end up coming across that set, as it were?
Going back to the Stradbroke Entertainments, they wanted, or Joyce Hall wanted, a proper music hall. She called him a red-nosed comic. And I did this sort of act, this red-nosed comic, who was a sort of barrow boy. It wasn't as well defined as Max Miller, but it was a Cockney comic. And he didn't have a particularly outstanding voice or memorable script, but I did do something. And then Viv came along and said, "No, you do Max Miller." So I bought myself a couple of records of Max Miller's. I'd seen him at the East Ham Palace.
Really?
Some years when I was probably about 9 or 10, and I didn't remember much about him except the loud suit and the white hat. But of course, he had the voice that was like a very, very nasal, very, very loud. And I thought, well, I can't do that for a full act. So it became very, very nasal and very, very loud and very Max Millerish. And you get the catchphrases and the they'll never make another one like him, lady. Miller's the name, lady, and things like that. But it was Viv who fostered that. And Margaret Bryce made me a costume.
The blue one?
Yep. Well, she made me two, because they were stolen from the theatre, weren't they?
I didn't
know. They actually went out on fancy dress hire and never came back.
Oh, really? I never knew that.
And Rita, the one I have now, it's safely in my wardrobe under lock and key. And Rita made it. Yeah.
So out of all the performances that you've seen, what are the standout ones, do you think? Both musicals and plays.
Are you talking specifically for the Kenneth More Theatre?
No, anything. What's inspired you? What have you seen, West End or anything?
The one I liked very much, oh crikey, you're going to catch me with the title now, was one that David Suchet did about 4 or 5 years ago about the death of Pope John Paul I. Yes. The Last Confession, it was called. Yes. David Mamet.
Yes.
Absolutely standout performance. But performances, to me, are associated, rightly or wrongly, with the length of the part. If a performance is a long role, the tendency is that you admire it. Now, that may be because I find the long roles very, very challenging, but great fun. Once you've done the work, once you've learned them, it's a breeze, isn't it?
Yeah.
You just, you learn your lines, don't bump into the furniture.
I always remember, my thing was always, I became almost superstitious. I would run all my lines for whatever show or play I was doing every morning in the shower. And it would get to the point where the longer the part, the longer the shower.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah, I guess so.
And you've done many Agatha Christie's as well.
Yes.
But what's been your favourite one of them?
Well, again, the one I've done recently, and then there were none. Which started off life as 10 Little Indians and went through several other incarnations.
Of names, but shall remain silent at this point.
But it was quite interesting because I've just done the last one last year, and I was thinking about the various casts of who has been in them. People like Alan Groner and John Gadd who've been in them but not playing the same parts.
No.
And I played the judge in 4 of them each time. I remember in the first one, Viv had this absolutely wacky curtain call when everybody had to dive over the cliff. Everybody had to dive over the balustrade at the back. They took the bow and then went and dived over, and it was just totally farcical, really. The whole cast just dives over the balustrade. But he did it first. So that no one was hurt. He knew that. And that brings me to another thought. When we did Sweeney Todd, which I hadn't mentioned as one of the challenging parts, we got the chair and the little chute where people get their throats cut, go down the chute. Viv was the first one to do it.
Really? Go
down the chute, because you had to, the L-shaped seat moved into a straight shoot, and you had to keep your head back so that you wouldn't bump your face on the lip of the trapdoor. And Viv did it first, and once he'd done it, everybody else did it. See, leading by example.
Always,
Yeah.
always has. What's gone wrong for you then in the shows? Is there anything?
There
gives you cold sweats, as it were.
There was one show in which the stage manager played two cruel jokes on me. I will tell you the name of the stage manager at the end if you want to know. This was a play called The Day's Mischief. Rita was in it as well, and I played the part of this recovering alcoholic, this alcoholic journalist who had been a good boy. He hadn't touched a drop for about 4 years, and then suddenly he receives a phone call to tell him his wife has attempted suicide. Now, the phone call, I didn't know that there was a phone that was going to be live. So the phone rings, he picks it up, and unlike the Crossroads syndrome, where the phone carries on ringing when the bloke's picked it up or something like that, there was a voice on the other end of this call, and this voice is going to tell me that my wife has attempted suicide. So I pick up the phone and I say, yes, this is Henry Vining. And the voice is, hello, your eyes are undone. I'm getting all this from the voice of the stage manager, who is the other end of the phone. And I am supposed to convey to the audience that I've got this police message from, and I'm sweating buckets by this time. So I go over to the flask of whiskey, which is on the sideboard, which I had chosen as watered down Coca-Cola. Yeah. But when I got there and I pick up this whiskey and I pour my half glass, it's real whiskey. And the plot demands that I drink this half of a carafe of whiskey during the next act. So I've got to finish the half a flask. And it's real stuff. So I decided the only way I could do this was to drink it all during the last 2 or 3 pages. And eventually I glug and glug and glug. And I got rid of the flask, and I thought I felt so good afterwards. We got to the end of the curtain call. I took my hand of the actor on this side and that side, and I went down from my bow, and I don't remember coming back up again. And that was Colin Bully. Remember Sylvie Bully?
Yeah.
Sylvie Bully, her husband, was a real joker. But other than that, nothing much has gone wrong. I forgot my lines in a Poirot once, and Robert Quarry dug me out because he and I were the only people on stage. I've always worked on the basis that there's always somebody on the stage who knows where you are. Mm. Even if 2 or 3 people have a mental block, somebody knows where you are. And there were only 2 of us, and I didn't know. Robert did.
So is there any parts you go, I would still love to play that, or I wish I had played it when I was castable?
Viv has asked me this so many times, because towards the end of our careers at the KMT, he said, is there anything you want to do? Is there anything? And I thought, well, actually, there really isn't. There's nothing that I want to do, except in 2004, we were doing Richard III, and I was going to direct it. And for some reason, we had to juggle it about. And I ended up playing Richard. I didn't particularly want, I would love to have done, but in 2004, I was 62. I mean, Olivia was too old when he played it, but I was twice as old as I should have been.
Yeah.
But anyway, Viv ended up directing it. I did Richard III, and probably that was the only one that I would have coveted if I'd been younger. But I loved it. Again, it was back where Shakespeare, back where I felt I belonged.
So what's next for you at the moment? What are you up to show-wise and that?
Probably nothing. I was doing these little murder mysteries, and I have you to thank for that, because up here are all your scripts, all mine, and all Ricky's, I think.
Oh, really?
And they're the murder mysteries that you taught me how to do, and that I perpetuated when you drifted off somewhere else, which I loved. But then again, it's a chapter which has closed, I think, really, because I've found that learning the lines is a chore now. It's become more of a chore than it is a pleasure, and that's the time to stop.
What would we need to do to bring you out of your self-imposed retirement then?
Ricky asked me that when I said I wasn't going to do any more. And I honestly, I mean, I really, really can't think. I really can't think. I think even another Amadeus woun't do it. Wouldn't do it.
So it'll be watching in the audience more than.
Oh yes, oh yes. And I do like watching. I see some. Going back to a earlier question of yours, I love watching the likes of Peter Beadle. I love watching Ian Brown, who is he's a lovely bloke, great to be with on stage. John Gadd, all these, and Jackie Lodge, who's never put a foot wrong in my life, in my experience. Just great people to watch.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Reg. It's been an absolute pleasure and lovely to see you again. And so I can't imagine how many shows you've done, let alone how many we did together, especially within the last 20 years.
Yes.
Yeah, neither of us look old enough for it.
That would be an interesting statistic.
Yeah, and I imagine Viv has actually done that at some point.
I'm sure he has. I'm sure he has. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So look after yourself and take care.
Thanks, Owen. Thank you very much.